a double cross on the founding of the NHL, and his newest book, The Oddfellows Heart, explores early hockey in Montreal. This afternoon, Morey's going to talk about hockey during the 1885 smallpox epidemic in Montreal. Turn it over to you, Morey.
Thanks, Bill. The first thing I'm going to do is apologize because I never took French and I'm going to butcher some names. So no disrespect intended to the deceased or future deceased. So we'll just start with that. Look around you. What do you see? Do you see a neighborhood, a community, a city, a nation, a continent, an earth, looking at the physical and economic devastating effects of a worldwide pandemic? Like a Zoom SIR meeting instead of being in person because of the timing and fear of planning an event that could possibly lead to some of our deaths? Who is that over there? Is that the ghost of Conn Smythe? Is he laughing as we are being intimidated by our government, our leaders? Or do you see an opportunity? Do you see someone in your community, a neighbor, a child who had a year and a half of idle time on their hands and spent it dreaming of a better place, a better world, something new, something different? Trying to perfect hockey moves in the safety of the outdoors, figuring out a way to better utilizing the dimensions of space and time to create something new in hockey, something few people ever have. You know the names: Taylor, Morenz, Richard, Howe, Orr, Bossy, Gretzky, Lemieux, Brodeur. Maybe there's a kid in the Arizona desert who dreams of one day being the next savior of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Can't happen? Look around you. Although it might feel like it, COVID-19 was not the first pandemic that wreaked havoc in the world. Just in the hockey world, there have been 5. Prior to 2020, the 3 most recent were in a 30-year period, with the most recent being the disruption due to World War II. Somehow, the trifecta of Frank Calder, Red Dutton, and Maurice Podolov managed to keep professional hockey alive. The 2 events prior that didn't kill off our favorite sport were actually related. World War I stripped Canada of its best hockey players, and the Canadian military even iced a team made up of the best conscripted recruits. And after the war, when many of these young men returned home, they brought the strange, deadly disease with them, the original H1N1 virus. There were some 675,000 deaths in the United States alone, including Hall of Famer Joe Hall, who died a week after the Stanley Cup final was canceled. In Volume 1 of The Life of Reason, the great Harvard philosopher George Santayana is famed for writing, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." 4 volumes and 755 pages later, he added, "History is always written wrong, and so always needs to be rewritten." So look around you. What events today are happening that will be tomorrow's history? And what are we looking at today that we think is important while missing the things that truly are? The child's game of hockey has been around for generations, being played in Scotland, Ireland, and England, before winding its way to the United States and Nova Scotia, and eventually Montreal. Several people tried to adapt and codify the game, but the rules were always changing, and drastically too. Should we play on a 400-foot length rink on the St. Lawrence River, or indoors? How many players on the ice? 7, 9, 15? The first epidemic and concurrent political divide that disrupted hockey reinvented hockey. That particular epidemic started innocently enough. 1 month after Montreal's Winter Carnival ended, February 28, 1885, a young couple from Chicago were coming home from the European honeymoon via the Grand Trunk Railroad. The wife became ill in the train. She had smallpox. The train car was not sanitized, and the man who cleaned the car became ill. His family became smallpox victims as well. The train made its way to Montreal, and both the porter and conductor were felled by the disease and were taken to Hotel Dieu Hospital. The conductor, George Longley, initially arrived at Bonaventure Station feverish and covered with fiery eruptions on his hands, face, chest, and arms. Since Longley was a Protestant, he was rushed to Montreal's General Hospital. There, the resident physician diagnosed him with smallpox and refused to admit him. Knowing not where to turn, Longley arrived to the gates of the Hotel Dieu, where a nun assisted him. "Why did you not go to the English hospital?" the nun asked. "I went there but was refused," Longley said. "Then we are happy to have you here," the nun replied. Hotel Dieu, or the House of God, was located on the outskirts of McGill University campus, the epicenter of the hockey movement since 1875. Longley recovered and survived, but his bedding infected Pelage Robichaud, an Acadian girl who worked in the laundry. She died on April 1st, and was soon followed by her sister Marie. By mid-April, it was clear smallpox was loose in the hospital and could not be contained. The health department then made a catastrophic mistake. They released all patients who did not appear sick. Many were in the stage of incubation, and they set the virus loose on the streets of Montreal. The incubation period between contraction and the first obvious symptoms was around 12 days. The initial obvious symptoms mirrored that of the flu and the common cold. A fever as high as 101 degrees Fahrenheit, muscle pain, a malaise, headache, prostration. As the digestive tract was usually involved, nausea, vomiting, and backache have often occurred. The porter and conductor were attended to by family and nursing staff, none of whom were inoculated. And the final results tallied 3,164 dead Montrealers, mostly children, thanks to the train. The real tragedy of the smallpox epidemic was that it was completely preventable. Edward Jenner of England developed a vaccine in 1796 and it was widely available. But French Canadians were the 19th century anti-vaxxers. Many of the French-speaking Montrealers were Catholic and had large families, living in overcrowded tenement housing in some of the poorest quarters of the city. Dr. Louis Martel, a native of St. Hyacinthe, had practiced in Montreal before emigrating to Lewiston, Maine. Martel wrote, "I witnessed the smallpox epidemic. There was some opposition to vaccination for two reasons. Firstly, because two reputable doctors, one of whom was a university professor, were themselves opposed. Also, because the virus used was bad, so bad that in some cases, arms had to be amputated." It would be easy to blame the ignorance and mistrust of the French Canadians as the epidemic grew, and many people in border states such as Maine did just that. But Anglo-French relations were particularly tense during the summer and fall of 1885. The Anglo authorities had just arrested Louis Riel in May and would execute him in November, prompting widespread protests. In Montreal, the French Canadians were in no mood to have government-mandated vaccination imposed on them by the English. Riel was the eldest of 11 children born in the Red River settlement, which was then a community in Rupert's land. Today, the town is called St. Boniface, Manitoba, just across the Red River from Winnipeg. Rupert's land was a large swath of land extending from the Arctic Ocean to parts of present-day Minnesota and North Dakota. The British North America Territory was administered by the Hudson Bay Company, which was granted charter by King Charles in 1670, and following a merger with the Northwest Company in 1821, extended to the Pacific Ocean. The Rupert's Land Act of 1868 of UK's Parliament authorized the sale of Rupert's land to Canada. No one bothered to ask the Aboriginal people if they were interested in selling. The First Nations people understood various treaties to be between nations to share the land because ownership was not a concept in First Nations culture. The British Crown held the attitude that the treaties were a peaceful approach to settlement over land the Crown already owned. This led to a problem with First Nations natives and some of the white settlers who moved into the area and worked and lived side by side. To quickly summarize this history, when Riel returned from studies in Montreal, he found that religious, nationalistic, and racial tensions increased from a major concern to exacerbation with the movement west of Anglo-Protestants of Ontario. Riel organized the community and attempted to contest Ottawa's authority unless the federal government negotiated with the Métis. But the local Anglos tried to force Riel's hand by forming an opposition party to overthrow Riel's provisional government. The opposition party, called the Canadian Party, suffered a setback when 48 members were arrested near Fort Garry. Thomas Scott was the most ornery of the group. The first trial saw Charles Bolton sentenced to death. Riel listened to others and commuted the sentence, only to face criticism of weakness by Scott. William Gaddy was the second to be found guilty of treason and was given a death sentence, as demanded by the Métis. Gaddy was led to one of the bastions at Fort Garry, but allowed to escape. Scott then openly quarreled with his guards, who demanded he be tried for insubordination. Scott was found guilty and was also sentenced to death. Despite several pleas to commute the sentence, Riel replied, "I have done 3 good things since I have commenced. I have spared Bolton's life at your instance, I pardoned Gaddy, and now I shall shoot Scott." He did. The Canadian government took Riel seriously and negotiated the Manitoba Act with the Métis, allowing Manitoba to become a province, but also respecting the Métis land rights. The Canadian government was not done with Riel yet, but Parliament soon passed the Dominion Land Act, which gave a claimant 160 acres for free, with the cost to the farmer being only a $10 administration fee. Any male farmer aged 21 years of age and who agreed to cultivate at least 40 acres of the land qualified. The purpose of this act was twofold: to prevent any other rebellions from First Nations communities and to hold off the rapidly growing United States from heading north as well as west as part of the U.S. program of Manifest Destiny. In 1884, Riel was called upon to tease leaders in Saskatchewan to articulate their grievances to the Canadian government. Instead, he organized a military confrontation, the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. Using the new rail lines produced by immigrant labor, the Canadian government sent thousands of combat soldiers. Riel was arrested and convicted for high treason. Despite protests and popular appeals, Prime Minister Macdonald rejected calls for clemency, and Riel was executed by hanging on May 20th, 1885. Said one juror, "We tried Riel for treason. We hung him for murdering Scott." An even more important long-term impact was the bitter alienation that French Canadians across Canada felt, and anger against the repression by their countrymen. Riel was considered a hero in French Canada, and the Macdonald government came under international criticism for its handling. And this was in the mindset of much of the French population when the English government of Quebec tried to protect all of its inhabitants against the spread of smallpox. But when logic didn't work because of mistrust, the Anglo leaders decided to use force. Élie Gagnon lived in a rickety tenement house at 19 Rollin Lane. 2 of the laborers' children had been infected with smallpox, and a health officer was sent to the dwelling. Gagnon suffered knowing his children were suffering, and yet he also had a wild fear of the detested health officials. For 3 days, Gagnon kept the officers at bay, successfully guarding his scourge-stricken castle against all intruders. On November 3, 1885, Sergeant Carpenter of the Montreal Police Department and Sergeant Moran of the Sanitary Police Department arrived at Gagnon's front door. The 2 men were accompanied by 4 constables. They proceeded to the house, expecting to surprise Gagnon and arrest him. On their arrival, 2 policemen were set to watch from the front, and 2 others were sent to the back. The 2 sergeants now pushed the door leading into the passage at the front and succeeded in forcing it open. They then found themselves in the dark passage near the end, which was the door leading to Gagnon's apartment. Sergeant Carpenter knocked on the door, demanding admission. Gagnon on the other side swore if they got in through the door, he would blow their brains out. After saying this, Gagnon went to the back window, evidently expecting an attack from the rear. Just at this moment, Officer Quinn, one of the policemen, sorry, I lost my spot. After saying this, at this moment, Officer Quinn, one of the policemen assigned to the rear, was ascending the steps leading to the gallery, which was on the back entrance. Quinn had successfully climbed 3/4 of the way when Gagnon came to the window. About 10 feet from Quinn, Gagnon thrust out his revolver and fired at Quinn, missing him. Quinn dropped on down and ducked below, another shot fired in his direction. A crowd of 150 gathered and showed every sign of attacking the police. Gagnon came in front of his house and fired a shot over the heads of everyone. No one was hurt. Newspaper articles did not mention it, but city directories showed that the neighborhood had French surnames, and the police definitely did not. The press certainly made it an issue. The next day, the French-language Montreal daily newspaper claimed that French speakers were being discriminated against and boycotted from the sanitary police, but no English speakers were. The press wanted to know if the orders came from Captain Kennedy or if the order came from a higher quarter. The paper claimed that 3/4 of the present employees did not speak French, while the French-Canadian members were being dismissed were fluent in both languages. A number of French-Canadian houses were being guarded by men who understood only English. In that environment, along with the recent memory of Louis Riel, can it not be a surprise what Gagnon did? In this environment, there was no way that Montreal could host a fun and games carnival. The official reason given for the cancellation was to stop the spread of the disease. But realistically, it was hard to plan a party when the region was on the brink of a civil war fought by smallpox survivors. With the Montreal Carnival's announced cancellation, 2 American cities jumped into the fray. St. Paul, Minnesota hosted their first winter carnival. It still runs today. And the organizers hired the ice cathedral designer to make their castle. The other carnival was closer to Hockey Center, Burlington, Vermont. Located a little less than 100 miles from Montreal, and it offered to host a tournament on Lake Champlain. Despite problems during the first 2 carnivals, hockey was going back outdoors. I've just spent the last several minutes talking about the political, health, and economic issues that were on the minds of most American Montreal adults between hockey seasons. And yet rewritten history shows that the most lasting contribution were these 5 words. The Montreal Carnival's announced cancellation. While French Canadians were dying, the smallpox epidemic rarely touched the English citizens, most of whom were vaccinated. The smallpox epidemic slowly faded away by December of 1865, And while plans for a festival were long canceled, the young, single, English-speaking men of Montreal, who made up all of the city's hockey clubs, met in the long-demolished Crystal Skating Rink, diagonally across from Notre Dame Cathedral, and decided to create a little city competition for themselves. In order to do that, the four Montreal club leaders decided to update, formalize, publicize, and share hockey's rulebook. This effort is the birth of the modern evolution of hockey, a direct descendant to the game being played today. The four men who cobbled these rules together in December 1885 have been largely ignored. Jack Arnton Jr., famed rugby and baseball player, wanted the offsides rules included. And speed skater Jimmy Stewart are the true architects of hockey. The two captains of the Victorian Crystal Ring teams were supported by committee members Charles Swaby, a recent civil law graduate at McGill University, and Montreal Lacrosse Club captain James W. Woods, who helped organize the first league as well as write the rulebook. The four young men borrowed a complete couple of rules from the experimental years, and they relied upon their expertise as a fast skater, Stewart, the offsides rule of a rugby player, Arnton, and the excitement of lacrosse, Woods, to cultivate the version of hockey played the world over today. Unfortunately for the 24-year-old Woods, his career as a traveling salesman took off and he never did play any games, watching afar and reading the reports in the Ottawa area, which was his territory for the Montreal-based Hodgkin Sumner and Company. Woods was one of two salesmen for the company, which imported goods from England and looked for markets to sell the goods. Woods was a natural. Swaby would move to Toronto and attend Osgoode Hall Law School, and he would be instrumental in forming the Toronto Victorias. By December of 1886, 1 year later, Arnton and Stewart had completely rewritten the rules. Some of them you might have heard of, like Section 1. The hockey stick can be any length that suits the player, but must not be more than 3 inches wide. Check out Rule 10 of the NHL rulebook. 3 inches wide is still the rule. Or Section 2. The puck must be 1 inch thick and 3 inches in diameter and of vulcanized rubber. NH Rule 13 is verbatim. Section 3. The top of the goals must be 6 feet above the ice, including any top ornament, and 6 feet wide. This was soon changed to 4 feet high, and within a couple of years, or 4 by 6, just like NHL Rule 2.1. Section 7. A match shall be decided by the team winning the greatest number of games during a given time. Games must in all cases be won by putting the puck through the goals from the front side. Rules were all over the map during the preceding 9 years. Some matches were decided by the team that first scored a set number of goals, others by time. This rule is basically intact today. Section 8, or Rule 77 in the NHL rulebook. The time of the matches shall be 2 half hours, with 10 minutes rest in between. In case of tie, the play will continue until one side scores a goal. The codified birth of sudden death overtime, one of the most unique traits of any sport, where a player can hit a goalpost on one shot and the other team can come back and win 3 seconds later. Section 9, when the puck goes off the ice behind the goals, it shall be taken by the referee to 5 yards at right angles from the goal line and there faced. When the puck goes off the ice at the sides, it shall be taken by the referee to 5 yards at right angles from the boundary line and there faced. Replace 5 yards or 15 feet with 20 feet, and you have today's NHL dimensions. Section 14, on the infringement of any of the above rules, the puck shall be brought and a bully shall take place. Still applies, of course, but the bully has been replaced by a face-off. I've just read you 7 of the 14 rules that these 4 men wrote in an arena long lost at the corner of Rene Levesque and Guy. There is nothing to ignore in that epidemic that resulted in the deaths of thousands and whose families were forever altered due to the political and economic landscape. But those young people who ignored the goings-on forged a new trail that would lead to the Stanley Cup, a trail that would alter the lives for generations who follow. I challenge you to look around your neighborhood. What do you see? What change is coming? I don't know where or how or when, but I can promise something was created during the last 2 years, and it's going to be great. Silence.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Morey. Nothing has come out in the chat box, but I had a question. I may have missed it. How many people did have smallpox in Montreal, and then how many died?
The number that were infected, I don't know. I just had the death number. It was about 3,600. It was about 2% of the population, if those numbers sound familiar.
Okay, good.
There's a lot of comparisons or comparables between COVID-19 and the Spanish flu of 1919 and the smallpox epidemic in terms of people affected.
Yes, fascinating that the Spanish flu story. I think that was the last
That was covered.
virtual meeting or the one
covered.
before it. So it's kind of an interesting time when you see the parallels to the current situation we're just coming out of. So
yeah, and I know there was a lot of history, and I'm sure for our Canadians on board, it's a lot of stuff they got in grade 5 or whatever. But a lot of Americans don't know this stuff, and so I really had a hard time trying to condense it enough to not bore Canadians, but also give context from Americans. So.
good. See, no more questions, but I see someone put up their thumbs that enjoyed your insights, Morey. Thank you very much. Really a fascinating story. I know many had forgotten about the smallpox epidemic of that time, and you've tied things together very nicely. So
yeah, it was important to realize that both things were happening concurrently. And, things, A leads to B leads to C leads to D. So the fact that both of these things were happening concurrently affected the carnival. When the carnival got affected, then the guys who wanted to play hockey, who were not affected by the epidemic, they wanted to play. So they figured it out. They got it together.
One question has popped up here. A lot of detail in there, Morey. Tell us about your research and how did you go about doing that from San Diego or from the California area?
Yeah, well, all of my research wasn't done here. The base of it was done. About 2.5 years ago, before the pandemic, I did a field trip with my son, and we went to Toronto, we went to Quebec City, we went to Ottawa, we went to Kingston, we went to Toronto to do research in this area of hockey history that is basically unknown. When I first started with SIR 20 years ago, these players had last names and initials. They had no first names. You could even go back and look at the NHL official record guides on the Stanley Cup champions, and some of them didn't even have a first name or a first initial. They're just last names. So there was a lot of these people were so important, but largely forgotten. My intention was to try to find the missing link between the evolution of the sport that JP, Patrick Huda, and he's going to kill me. Professor in Sweden wrote about.
Carl Giddin.
Yeah, Carl. Yeah, Carl wrote about and try to connect that up because that certainly wasn't the game that we watched today. The game that we watch today, of course, is faster, but there's still elements of the game that we watch today that didn't even exist, even as far back as 1875. And so that led me to researching the carnival, and the different rules would change in the carnival, sometimes even mid-carnival. I don't want to discredit somebody's presentation from a few years ago, but there was when they had the winter carnival games in Burlington, they decided that the ice was too bad, so they just played 10-minute halves for the championship. I can't imagine going to a hockey game for 20 minutes and then say, that's it, see you guys. And that's what they had done. So this was a way of formalizing it, getting it down on paper, putting in a city tournament since there couldn't be any kind of winter carnival. And from that, there was just kind of a work in progress. And one could probably argue that the NHL has been a work in progress for 100 years. Every year or two, there seems like there's another little change.
Yes.
But the part of the game that we recognize, that if you saw a game in 1886, you would recognize it as hockey. Slower. If you saw a game in 1875, you'd recognize that as maybe a bunch of mites with a, throw a 6-year-old, throw a puck in the corner and watch them chase it. So.
Good. Thank you very much, Morey.